All right. Welcome to Podcasting 101. I'm Sebastian Garcia. I am a podcast producer for the University of Central Florida's History Department. I appreciate you all coming in today. Lunch, morning, we all got busy lives, busy schedules. So I really appreciate you coming out here and learning a little bit about podcasting. Um, I'm going to briefly introduce myself. Like I said, I am the podcast producer for the UCF History Department. I've served in that capacity for 3 years. I produced 4 podcast series that you see all on the right: Night's History Cast, Florida's Local Quarterly Podcast, and then the 2023-2024 podcast series. All those shows are very interview heavy. We'll get to that more later, sort of the differences between an interview show and a narrative show. 43 episodes across those 4 series. I've also have a lot of experience in sort of working with an institution on how to start a podcast at a university. I did not start Night's History Cast, but when I became the podcast producer for UCF, the whole system lay dormant for about a few years, partly because of COVID, partly because the previous podcast producer was looking to step down, so she kind of just neglected it a little bit. And so learning, working with sort of professors, HR, and all that stuff. So I also have experience, if anyone's here for some more institutional, know-how on how to start a podcast at a university. I also have experience with that. I've been fortunate enough to receive awards with my work. And then I am currently co-producing the Memory of Negro Fort podcast, which is a mini-series narrative podcast about a fort built by the British during the War of 1812 on the Apalachicola River by present-day Tallahassee. And we're really looking at how different groups of Americans remembered, erased, and evoke the memory of that fort throughout time since its destruction in 1816. And similarly, I have experience also with pedagogy. And, there's a micro-credential in the works that Ari and I have sort of been co-developing, and she's been great, for a lot of reasons, helping us, set up this event and all that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when I get to sort of the resources slide. But before we kind of move forward, I want to hear from a few of you, who you are, just your name, where you're from, sort of FIU or FIU departments, and what interests you about podcasting. Like, why are you here? Great. I appreciate everyone introducing themselves. I like how we're an interdisciplinary bunch. That is very exciting. And yes, yeah, feel free. I really like how we're all here from different disciplines. That's sort of the beauty of podcasting. And of course, a lot of the examples that I'll be talking about come from a history experience as a graduate student in history, but that is by no means sort of exclusive to that, right? And I kind of designed this workshop very broadly for that reason. Great. So I like to open up with these statistics from the Pew Research Center to sort of demonstrate the current podcasting landscape. So in this first chart, this is from their study called Podcasts as a Source of News and Information, came out in 2023. This one is really important, I think, for scholars, whether you're from sciences, humanities, and whatnot, because it really demonstrates how a major reason why U.S. podcast listeners say they venture into podcasting is to learn. As you can see here, 55% of U.S. podcast listeners who say to learn is a major reason why they listen to podcasts. If we go on to the next chart, like I said, history focused, but science and technology is tied for 40%. So again, there's this sort of demand to learn and to discover with podcast listeners. And I guess to laugh too, because comedy is 47%. But this is really important when I talk to general audiences about what is history, why history matters. There's a popular perception of history being dry and boring, and just a bunch of facts and people. And this chart sort of demonstrates how there is an audience out there that wants to learn about history in different and unique ways, and podcasting is one of those ways that we can do that. But like I said, there's a lot of popular science and technology podcasts that are out there. whether they're interview shows or whether they're narrative shows. So again, this is just providing more evidence that an audience exists. And my goal here today is to sort of introduce tips and tricks on how we could potentially tap into that audience, right? Another sort of chart here. So the previous two were about listeners. This is more about categories of podcasts. So percentage of top ranked podcasts that are primarily about whichever topic. And again, history ranks, 4% or 4% of 451 podcasts. Quite a few. And again, science and technology still ranks here. So, again, just to sort of demonstrate how there's an audience that exists. Now, this is a recent study, just came out a month and a half ago, September 2025. And this is more about news. And so US adults, 32% of US adults get news from podcasts at least sometimes, and 6% prefer getting their news from podcasts rather than any other sort of platform, whether it's newspaper, radio, television, websites, and whatnot. And I like this chart because it's similar to sort of the learning aspect that people are going to this medium to learn, but more broadly and fundamentally, I would argue people are venturing into this medium to know more about the world around them, right? And as scholars interested in producing knowledge about the world around us, this is sort of an exciting opportunity for us to engage with this audience in a real and meaningful way. So that's why I like this chart. And sort of, I just got these two screenshots from FIU's Public Humanities Lab and also the College of Arts and Humanities at UCF of kind of what I just said. So if we look at the mission statements of each of these institutions, it's essentially to tell stories, preserve histories, engage with communities. And same thing with UCF, it's to help our students see the world through different lenses. And so there is a dynamic here between knowledge seekers and knowledge bearers, as I like to call them. There's people in the public seeking this knowledge, this discovery, and then us working in these institutions and dedicating our professional lives to sort of learning and studying and creating new knowledge. There's a complementary ethos here, right? And podcast is one way that we can sort of strengthen that connection. And again, my hope with this presentation or with this workshop is to sort of introduce strategies and skills that allow us to tap into that audience. And the why podcasting, another reason why I like those charts is because from a very broad perspective, it gives us the why. Like why as scholars, whether in the sciences or in the humanities, we should venture into podcasting. And hopefully, as we go forward into this workshop, we can sharpen that why by introducing the how. How exactly can we do this? All right, so that was just a little hook. Hopefully, but we're going to talk about sort of podcasting as a genre. I especially recently sort of producing this Memory of Negro 4 podcast, so that's been very exciting and challenging for various reasons. It's really sort of reinforced the idea that I think I've always had, but never was able to articulate it until now, is that podcasting is a genre. It's more than just simply uploading your RSS feed into the internet and people downloading it wherever they can. There is certain conventions, styles, rhetorical moves that undergird a production of a podcast. And I'm hoping in this workshop, I can sort of, by reframing podcasts as a genre, we can deconstruct some of those moves, right? And see how exactly we can make an effective chatting, people chatting show or interview show, as they call it, or an effective narrative podcast. I kind of just spoiled the second section. Two forms of podcasting. Now, if you do look into the literature, some scholars argue that there are more than two forms, but I subscribe to sort of the camp in that body of literature that when you break down all the podcasts, and it may sound a little reductive, but it's true. It really comes down to two major forms. It's either interview shows, people chatting, or people telling stories, narratives. And of course, there's different ways to sort of obtain those genres, but those are sort of the two fundamental forms of podcasting. And then we'll talk about sort of the practices of each. In sections 3 and 4, I'll share some strategies from my professional experience of how I go about chatting about my academic research or a scholar's academic research. And then I'll also share some strategies for telling stories through podcasting. Then lastly, the last major section, we'll talk about sort of technical considerations, right? Because despite podcasting's low entry of low barrier to enter and to start working on it, you still need to have some sort of understanding of how to operate a mixer, right? And so I brought my equipment sort of as a little show and tell. When we get to that section, I'll pass it around so you all can kind of feel the equipment and hopefully not be as intimidated by sort of working at. I'm co-producing that podcast about the memory of the four with another grad student who has no experience podcasting. So I've really been able to teach him along the way, and which has helped me sort of refine my own skills. And I guess it's because I've been doing it for so long and so frequently that I kind of have forgotten myself how this equipment, although it seems very simplistic, can be a little intimidating. So I wanted to dedicate a section just to kind of, for all of you that are interested in hopefully doing your own podcast in the future, you have a better understanding of sort of how to actually record and edit and these things to actually tangibly make a podcast. And then I'll end with some resources, and then hopefully we have some time for a dynamic Q&A. Podcasts, as they say, its cousin is radio. So yeah, there's definitely some overlap between other forms of media.
Technology Steve Jobs repackaged it to sell more.
That is definitely true. That is definitely true. So if we look at the Oxford English Dictionary for a definition of what a podcast is, they state that it's a digital audio file, speech, music, broadcast material, etc., made available on the internet for downloading to a computer or portable media player. A series of such files and installments of which can be received by subscribers automatically. And what I like about the Oxford English Dictionary, it's a great source for historians because it kind of demonstrates the etymology of a word and how it's evolved over time. And so, famously, it was coined in 2004. They don't have the example here, but it was coined by a journalist, I can't remember his name, from The Guardian, and essentially combining the word broadcast, iPod, video podcast. But I like this 2008 sort of usage of the term. Podcasts are architecturally unique in their relationship to e-learning, in large part because of the many different ways they can be employed. And that's sort of the crux of this workshop, that I hope to sort of introduce these different ways and deconstruct these different ways to sort of how these podcasts come to be. So like I said, podcasting as a genre, it goes beyond sort of that simplistic definition of it's just a series of audio files uploaded to the internet that anybody can download, right? There is a set of production and consumption practices that are, definitely they're not static, they're fluid, right? And that's sort of the beauty of any sort of genre, is that you can modify, utilize, and subvert some of these conventions based on your specific goals with the production, and then create something new out of it, right? So if we just take genres as having a communicative purpose in which characteristic moves help achieve, then that allows us, as I said earlier in the introduction, to sort of deconstruct what these moves are. Even as someone that produces a lot of podcasts and is in the field and has been in the field for a long time, I still open my Spotify. I use Spotify, so I still open Spotify and try to find new podcasts, and it's overwhelming. There's so many out there, and it feels like everyone nowadays wants to start their own podcast. And so this deluge, this flood of podcasts, make it seem like there's so many different forms, so many different ways to do it, and what helps me at least is to understand that yes, these podcasts are very unique in their content. They're all talking about sort of different things, but there are similar sort of rhetorical moves and choices that these productions do to achieve their specific goals. And so again, I'm hoping that in this workshop we can kind of deconstruct some of these goals. And I have this in sort of the resource slide when we get there, but This article by Christopher Drew, the educational podcast and genre analysis is incredibly useful. I highly recommend reading it if you want to learn more about sort of what podcasting and podcast as a genre and what that all means. And again, I have that in the resource page if you're interested. So before we get into sort of the specifics again of sort of these moves, right? We need to understand what these two genres are. And so the two forms of podcasting: people chatting, people telling stories. The person on the left, he is Eric Newsom, scholar. Sorry, not a scholar. He's an author, writer, and a podcaster. And he came out with this book in 2019 called Make Noise, A Creator's Guide to Podcasting and Great Audio Storytelling. It's another sort of great read. I don't have that in the resources page, but definitely take note of that book if you want to learn sort of more tips and tricks. But as I kind of said earlier, there's more that he claims there's more than 700,000 podcasts available today, but they just fall in these two categories: people chatting and people telling stories. And then on the right is one of my mentors, Dr. Robert Casanello. He's an associate professor of history at the University of Central Florida. He is mainly responsible for a podcasting infrastructure existing at UCF. He was the one that first started a podcast, or at least introduced it to students in a way that it could be expanded later on. And he also agrees with Eric Newsom. He says that, there are two types of podcasts. There's what he calls synthesis podcasts, and I like that term because people chatting, the interview shows, they're not really creating new bodies of knowledge. They're just synthesizing material and sort of presenting it to audiences. Whereas there are podcasts that are production of knowledge, right? And these are typically your narrative shows that are grounded in original research. They're formatted in a way in a narrative way to sort of engage audiences more emotionally at times. But he agrees that there's these two podcasts. So I interchange often between those two terms: people chatting and people telling stories. And so every time I talk to people about podcasting, I like to introduce, even though they're both essentially saying the same thing, I like to introduce the two different terminologies because I find them both useful, right? The synthesis and production of knowledge, especially as scholars interested in knowledge creation. It's important to understand how podcasting helps with that. All right, so people chatting or synthesis podcasts. So remember, when we think back of genres have a communicative purpose in which there are certain characteristic moves that help achieve that purpose. So for people chatting production, the communicative purpose is utilizing institutionalized conversation between two or more participants to explore various ideas and concepts. Now, what does institutionalized conversation mean? It basically means that conversation happens for a particular reason, and there are specific positions in which people occupy in that conversation. So a host and a guest. And when I get into sort of the examples from my experience of how you can sort of leverage those roles to better suit your needs and better achieve this sort of communicative purpose of synthesis or people chatting podcasts. And so these are the three moves. And move 1 and move 3 are from that article that I shared. I inserted move 2 based on my experience. So the first move that really characterizes this type of podcast is conversationalism. And essentially what that means is just an open dialogue between two or more people, right? And the second move, which is again what I introduced into this sort of matrix, is colloquialism. Part of being conversational, or at least trying to simulate an authentic and organic conversation, is to sort of speak in everyday, parlance, right? Like not using so much jargon in the conversation. And it's not dumbing it down, and that's something that I should say now. I was with another podcast expert / mentor of mine a few months ago. They were helping us out with the Negro Fort production, and we were sort of asking, well, how do you take these major concepts like historiography, history of history, like how do you take that and communicate it with a general audience? And this person said, we'll never use that word historiography ever in our podcast because you're just going to lose people. but that doesn't mean you can't still apply the concept, in the narrative or in the conversation. And by sort of using everyday language, it makes it clear to the audience while also not offending their intelligence, because your audience is smart. Remember, they seek you. Yes, you seek them to a certain extent, but ultimately the consumer has the choice, and that's sort of the attraction of podcasts. The consumer has the choice to turn you off and turn you on. It's not like broadcast radio where it's just all the time going on. It's on demand, right? So being cognizant of that is an advice that I've been told and something that I definitely embrace. And then move three is wit. And this is something that Christopher Drew sort of found in his genre analysis of podcasts, is that a lot of these interview shows, people chatting shows, either the host or the guests employ a lot of, comedy and wit, from my personal experience, I personally have not really tried that rhetorical move, because if I'm talking to an academic historian about their book, and maybe it's a very serious topic, it's hard to sort of insert a joke in there. But there are ways, and again, that's why I think move two is so important. If you just really try to engage in that conversation in sort of an everyday language parlance way, that still kind of gets you at the, I don't even want to say charisma that comes with the sort of that broader sort of idea of, oh wow, this person is very, I can understand them, I can relate to them. So with people telling stories or production of new knowledge podcasts, the communicative purpose is sort of to tell a story about an originally researched topic. And I bolded originally researched because, again, this type of podcast, this form of podcast, is very much in line with sort of, you have original research and you want to remediate it into the podcast medium. And the way you remediate it is through a narrative format, right? So, like I said, using narrative elements to create an intellectual and emotional learning experience, because as I'm sure we've all heard at some point in our lives that, I'm butchering the quote right now, but you don't remember what they say, you remember how you feel or how they make you feel, right? So that's kind of part of the incentive to use a narrative in sort of these very important but heavily dense research topics. Move one, storytelling, and that may seem very broad, but in employing sort of traditional narrative arcs like exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, disposition, the 5 narrative arcs. If you restructure your research in a way that fits that sort of thematic and narrative arc, you're most likely going to be able to tease out some of the not more interesting stories of your research, but definitely kind of reframe your research in a more sort of engaging way. And sort of another key part of move one, and again, when we get to the examples, I'm hoping this will be much more clear to you all. A critical element of move one is also to really focus on the individual, right? And in history, contrary to popular belief, there's actually a lot of interesting people from the past. Sometimes more interesting than the fictional characters that Hollywood comes out with. And so if we focus on sort of their lives and using their lives as a lens to understand these broader issues and concepts of their time, now we have sort of, that puts us in a position to really create a narrative about it in a way kind of similar to a fictional work, right? And you obviously have to be cognizant and sensitive of the individual and sort of the actual story that they left behind through primary sources. You can't, you have to be careful with the liberties you take in sort of extending their narrative. But I find that with the narrative podcasts that I've either listened to a lot or been a part of, like the Member of Negro Fort one, and one of the most effective ways to get at this storytelling is to focus on the individual. Move to signposting and cross-linking. That's actually very important. But even though nowadays there's a lot of transcripts that accompany these podcasts, um, for the most part, a lot of people are just listening. They're not reading. So it's very important in narrative podcasts, since it's really one voice dominating that whole episode. Obviously, you're gonna have multiple voices, like experts and voice actors, if that's something that you want to employ. But really, there's one voice carrying the entire production. Um, it's really important to clearly sort of mark transition words in the narrative, like there's, and we'll get to it in the example, but a podcast that I highly recommend everyone listening to if you want to learn more about sort of effective people telling stories production is Worlds Turn Upside Down by Jim McBusky, and I have that in the resource page. Um, he is an independent scholar, was at George Mason University. He's a historian, and that podcast is about the American Revolution. And what he does a lot, especially sort of after the hook of that episode, the way he signposts is by, saying first we'll go to London and explore sort of this person and why they were there. Then we'll travel back to the Atlantic and what the colonies were doing. So it's basically structuring the entire episode, segment 1, segment 2, segment 3, but not in such a mundane way. Like first we're going to talk about, like, it's sort of being immersed in that world, right? And then cross-linking essentially means referring to other works, and the most common way that people telling stories productions do this is by having like a further reading page, whether on the website or on the description. And so again, that kind of comes back to the whole production of knowledge, right? Like, we're introducing knowledge in this show, and if you want to learn more about it, here are these works, right? So it acts like a little bibliography in a way, historiography. Okay, some examples. So with Knight's History Cast, that is a podcast that features historians and their latest research, produced by me at the University of Central Florida. And so, like I mentioned earlier, the communicative purpose, define the roles of host and guest to bolster the communicative purpose of the genre form. So, for example, I am a graduate student. I started the show as an undergrad. So even back then it was even more so. But still, I leverage my status as a student to make the audience feel less distant from the expert, right? So I deliberately sort of play up my very sort of liminal status in the field of I'm not a professional yet, but I'm professionalizing. So I'm kind of in this in between sort of position. And sometimes I make that very clear. If you listen to some of the episodes in the beginning, I kind of summarize the conversation in the beginning, and then we go into the actual like interview recording. And in the beginning, I sometimes, really explicitly say like, oh, like this is a subject that was very interesting to me. I'm not a specialist in this, but I understand sort of the methods that they use to achieve this, to sort of write this book, whatever we're talking about. And I don't have it on the slide, but this comes back to a concept that Eric Newsom, so the writer that I mentioned earlier, in his book, he mentions that, who are you? Like, what version of you will dominate the show? And so that's a question that, as you're planning your podcast, you need to figure out, right? Are you going to be the graduate student that's kind of has both foot in these two worlds, and you're doing that on purpose so that you could connect these two worlds? If you have a podcast about strength training, are you going to play up sort of your experience as a strength training coach, right? So it's very important to define these roles, right? Who are you going to be as a host, and who do you want the guests to be in your show? And that should help you sort of achieve that purpose of, remember, institutionalized conversation, right? Why are you there? Why are you guys talking? For what reason? Defining those roles will help with that. Move 1, which was conversationalism. So, and this goes for everything. I'm glad we have a lot of people here that have done or are interested in oral histories. Although sometimes, depending, on how much of a traditionalist, I guess, you are with oral history, you're technically not supposed to do that. But I find that with all the interviews that I've done, whether it's for oral history, whether it's for podcasts, whether it's for radio, actively listening is the most important thing you can do during an interview because that sets you up for further conversation that remains meaningful and authentic to the source, right? Um, so I oftentimes write the term or the phrase or whatever the guest said that really caught my attention in sort of my notebook that I have with me. And once they're done giving their response, I circle back, right? I said, well, can we come back to this point you mentioned the response? That was really interesting. Sometimes instead of doing that, I also regurgitate what they said in their response as a follow-up question to generate that, further conversation. So conversationalism, it's just open dialogue, and a way to maintain that openness is by actively listening. So if there's anything you take away from this workshop is, to listen critically, listen carefully as a host. That is one of the most important, if not the most important thing, responsibility as a host or an interviewer. Move two, which was colloquialism. Again, it's just what I said earlier, employ an informal style of conversation. And again, that does not mean to dumb it down. You can still retain the intellectual rigor. Remember, the audience went to your show for a reason. They have an intellectual curiosity to learn. Remember those graphs that I opened with? A major reason why people listen to podcasts is to learn. So it's not to offend their intelligence, but it's to meet them where they are in terms of how you express it. So I refrain from using jargon. And, obviously I'm not going to tell my guests before we hit the recording, hey, by the way, don't use jargon. They could talk however they want to talk. My job as a host, and again, it comes back to defining your role, is to explain those terms either in the summary, the summary of the conversation, or in the recording itself, right? In my response back to them, I'll be like, well, talk to me a little bit more about historiography. What does that mean? And again, that's why follow-up questions are really important because you could sort of maintain that colloquialism by just shooting back the question in a form, like shooting back their statement in a form of a question. These are just sort of general advice. I figured since whether you're doing a people chatting show or whether you are doing a people telling stories production, you're going to be interviewed. Obviously, with an interview show, that's the entire crux of the program. But with telling stories production, if you want to include expert voices, you're going to be interviewing those people, right? So I figured to very briefly kind of go through some interview styles. So there's the Socratic, asking thoughtful, open-ended questions that enable deeper examination of a topic. So no leading questions, no loaded questions, just sort of your basic, best practices of interviewing. Egalitarian conversation that encourage equal participation from all participants. So I often say this to my guests, especially ones that are a little nervous to do the podcast, is that this is a conversation, not an interrogation. I'm not here to sort of drill you and get a gotcha moment, traditional from some journalists. Like, I'm not here to get you. I'm not here to make you look bad. I want to genuinely have a conversation with you about whatever, right? And you have some sort of expertise. And then there's this combative polemical debate style. I don't really have experience in that. And I guess besides that one, these are not mutually exclusive, right? You could have an egalitarian style while also having a Socratic conversation. This is sort of where I got these terms from. It's again from Eric Newsom's book. You have to decide sort of when you're planning your podcast, especially for an interview show, what sort of conversation you want to have. Inquisitive. So this is driven by intellectual curiosity and understanding someone's perspective on a topic. What I often call picking people's brains, which I love to do. And so with people chatting and synthesis productions, I often approach, my interviews in this manner. Again, since these podcasts are trying to synthesize this knowledge, so I'm just like, their mind is a gold mine, and I just, I'm mining it away. Investigative, this is more your traditional sort of journalism, which I have no sort of background in terms of, I didn't go to school for journalism, but I just, being a podcaster for 3 years and interviewing a bunch of people for radio and podcasting all histories, I picked up on some skills that journalists also employ, and this is one of them. And so this is mainly useful when you're doing these people telling stories show, right? So for those people telling stories / production of knowledge podcasts, I employ an investigative style of interviewing to ensure that I extract the specialized knowledge I seek from a particular expert on the topic. So for example, the Negro Fort podcast, episode 1 is really going to try to contextualize the fort, why it came to existence, what were the conditions that, sort of made this fort emerge. And we're talking to a lot of experts on the War of 1812 because that's the war in which the British built the fort, right? So when I'm talking to these experts, I have very specific questions from their book or from their research, because that is the knowledge that we need to sort of contextualize this moment. So I'm not approaching that interview by saying, tell me about your book, like these very open-ended conversational ways of sort of approaching a conversation. If had that been a people chatting show, that's how I would approach it. But since this is something that we're specifically talking about, well, they're more pointed questions. General advice, and this goes for, again, any sort of production, even though I know I have this under the people chatting. Remember, Newsom's which version of you will dominate, as that can really guide how you approach the interview. There is an implicit, sometimes explicit understanding that the interview / host holds a distinct authority on the conversation, so adjust those power dynamics accordingly. And so I have an example here in a podcast centered on conversations about careers in the humanities. You might want to lessen your authority as the host and expert to foster an inviting dialogue that encourages open and diverse perspectives on the topic, rather than sort of this authoritarian control of the subject. But conversely, in a podcast which you claim an expertise on, so for the memory of Negro Fort, we are claiming to have an expertise on how individuals remembered this fort, or erased or forgot or evoked the fort. We definitely want to embrace sort of our own standing in the field. So, and then don't be afraid to ask difficult questions. You are not their friend. That's a quote from another really well-known podcaster that I met earlier this year. And she basically, she shared a very powerful story of how she got really close with her interview subjects. But she still needed to ask those difficult questions. And so she kind of kept telling herself in her head, we're not friends, really. We're not friends. Like, even though we're building this great relationship and we can still have it, I have a job to do, right? So that's helped me too. Listen actively. I'm not going to belabor the point. I already said that's probably the most important thing as an interviewer. Use your questions as a rough outline. They're not the end all be all. If you don't get to some of your questions, that's fine. I know some people get really anxious if they don't ask all the questions in their document. If you do a pretty good job of preparing before the interview, oftentimes the interviewee is going to answer all those questions that you had in advance, right? And definitely you want to leave space for that improvisation, the follow-ups to maintain that authentic experience. Embrace your curiosity, right? This is sort of the privileges of being an interviewer. You have a special sort of position to really understand someone's perspective, and they're not going to be like, why are you asking me that? That's your job, is to ask questions. So embrace that curiosity. And this is something personal. I always try to challenge myself to receive that's a great question. That's a good question from my guests, because if you achieve that, especially early in the conversation, that demonstrates that you've done the work. And so it builds trust. So now they're more likely to share more with you. So not to say that the interviews that I don't get that are failures, but it's a nice challenge to have. Okay, so examples for people telling stories through podcasting. So again, I'm going to use the memory of Negro Fort, and this QR code directs you to a Google Forms to basically ask you for your name and your email to notify you all once the podcast is released, which we plan on releasing it in January of 2026. So please scan the QR code. We greatly appreciate it. But again, the communicative purpose is focused on individuals, right? When you're restructuring this research in a narrative arc. and again, kind of like what I said earlier, exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, disposition. So the exposition in this case is all this context of, you know, the relationship between, because the fort was inhabited by enslaved African Americans and Native Americans. And it was at that time in Spanish Florida, so it was a symbol of freedom, for slaves in Georgia and the Carolinas if they wanted to escape. This fort on the border of Florida offered escape and freedom. So, the exposition and the rise in action is sort of explaining the relationship between slavery and the early American Republic at that time, and why, you know, the founding generation refused to sort of address slavery at all in the Constitution, right? And sort of talking about that. And then the rising action is the Second War, the War of 1812, which gets overlooked generally, and what that meant for slaves and native peoples, right? This was another opportunity for them to ally themselves with the British to attain the freedom that the United States, you know, professed but wasn't really living up to. And of course, the climax in that case is sort of the destruction of the U.S. Army, led by Andrew Jackson, sent a U.S. Army Navy expedition to destroy the fort, and they shot a fiery cannonball, and it landed right on top of the fort's magazine. So all their gunpowder that they were storing. And so that's kind of, I mean, that's very sort of general and broad, but that's sort of the beats that you could take with it, right? Right. And so and another example is, and this applies to any sort of history or beyond, is sort of when you're in your expert interviews, designate a few, not all questions, but a few questions to sort of these individuals, right? Like these people in the story that occupy very central importance. And it's not just notorious or well-known figures like Andrew Jackson, but it's also someone like Isaiah Brown Jr., who his father was killed in the late 18th century from a border dispute between him and indigenous people. And so his mom or his wife told their son, "You need to avenge your father's death by fighting in Florida." So when the First Seminole War happened, Isaiah Brown Jr. went and fought to avenge supposedly his father's death. So people like that, nobody knows about him, right? But this person existed. There's primary source records that tell us that this person existed. And so even if you just structure a little bit of the episode, with that figure to sort of explain these larger issues of white and native violence at the turn of the 19th century, that helps us understand. It makes it more, not relatable, but it's just more concrete, right? So move one, storytelling. Adapt the rhetorical steps of soliloquy in theater, including voice articulations such as rushed and breathless, each during climactic moments of the stories and strategic pauses. And that's a quote from Christopher Drew, the article I mentioned earlier. If you listen to a lot of sort of these narrative shows, especially these history-based ones, yes, you purposely adjust your voice depending on the moment, right? It's a very climactic moment. You may want to be more dramatic about it. And obviously there's a balance. You don't want to overplay because it just comes off as cheap. But, silence is powerful. And, people talk about sound, but silence, is just as powerful as whatever sound effects you want to use. And so if there's this moment that happens, and even if you're just kind of communicating a point, you have some sort of music in the background. You cut the music, you finish your point, leave a few silences, leave a few seconds of silence there. That will resonate with your listener. Will make that point, it will register that point better. Voice actors, this is especially important if you work if you're not in the 20th century where audiovisual primary sources exist, which in our case that's the case, right? We're talking about something in the late 18th, early 19th century, which obviously audio and visual media did not exist. So in order for us to reconstruct this past, we are using voice actors. And this is a very common, rhetorical move that a lot of these narrative shows implement. And again, employ clear transition phases with the narrative to guide listeners effectively. And like I said, Worlds Turned Upside Down by Gina Busky, who also teaches sports actors. It's a great example of this. And sometimes, and this is not unique to him, but common to sort of this format, is they are still very explicit with sort of the research questions that are guiding that episode. They often put that in the beginning of the episode. But like, of course, they don't say my research questions are. They say how, first we're going to talk about sort of how the sport came to be and why it existed. And then we're going to sort of them explain the larger context of these issues that shaded the sport's existence and its destruction. So things of that nature. Something that I don't have here, but it was interesting to read and I want to share is that what Drew sort of argued in his article is that these people telling these stories, they're basically, it's a mix of these fictional elements with an audiobook narrative, right? So we think about sort of these, oftentimes these podcasts are remediated from an academic monograph, an academic journal article, or just research in general. You take that very sort of textual progression of a story, and you're kind of narrating it like an audiobook. But what you're doing with that is also introducing these themes of sort of that dominate fiction, exposition, right, action. So it's a blend of those two. And again, I have the article in the resources to want to read more about it. But I think I've always sort of, especially when I'm working with John, he's kind of like, well, why do we need this voice and this voice? When it's like, unlike an audiobook where it's just one voice going through the whole book, in a narrative podcast, people will tune you out. If you're talking for 45 minutes, they'll tune you out. And so a way to leverage the unique features of a podcast, which is to introduce multiple voices, is to sort of have those perspectives, whether they're expert scholars, whether they're voice actors, and so all of a sudden now that enriches and that makes the narrative more dynamic, right? And we all have that voice when we read books, right? When you're reading a book or reading anything, you have that voice. Oftentimes it's just that sort of, unless I guess you're reading fiction and you're reading a character's dialogue, you change the voice in your head, but most of the time it's just one voice, right? Or in podcasting, that materializes it. This is just something that I really, and this might not be applicable to you all, but I lately have been really mulling over this idea. Like I'm really starting to think that the dominance of these narrative shows are kind of a new microhistory. So this is just a screenshot. Don't mind all the highlights. That's how I read, my work. But sort of, this is from an excerpt from Jeremy Hopkins' historiography book, very influential. And so this is him talking about microhistory and sort of how it came to be. The microhistorians use these small-scale stories to construct a kind of total history different from the grand tableau of social historians, bringing together the different aspects of their subjects' lives to show how a single incident can illuminate much broader aspects of the culture. And so I was already sort of thinking about this before, sort of, rereading Hopkins' work, in this process of creating this podcast for the memory of the before and talking to a bunch of these experts like Jim and Lusky on how to create a successful narrative. It was always about the individual, And I'm like, that's kind of like a micro history in a way. We're using an individual to talk about larger themes. So I think it's just something that I'm thinking about. I wanted to share with you all. And another sort of, where I highlight here, skilled microhistorians are able to present their stories in ways that appeal to general audiences as well as specialists and students. So again, this core sort of objective of telling a story through this narrative, right? That's why I think this is kind of a new form of microhistory that's emerging. I don't have a slide for this. I was going to put a slide for this, and I wish I did, given the interest of oral histories. But I do think people chatting productions are also the new oral history. And it's not just also not exclusive to the academy. Even the most popular interview shows that you see, it's oftentimes talking about someone most of the times famous person's life. And they may not be cradle to grave oral histories as your traditional sort of format where were you born, just that, but there's specialized oral histories, sometimes about just a particular part of that person's life, and we want to explore it more. And this is not an idea that I came up originally fully. I'm part of the Humanities Podcast Network, which I have a link in the resources page. And we just had our annual symposium a few weeks ago, and there was a presentation from a group of scholars that talked about this idea of podcasts as a new oral history, given this proliferation of sort of people coming on these shows and talking about a particular aspect of their life, right? And so in a way, it's sort of blending those two forms of media together. It's podcast conversational style, but still focused on an individual story, which is what an oral history is. All right, so the hardware, the show and tell, and it's full of through, so we're good on time. So I'm gonna share all the equipment that I've used in my 3-year experience, starting with the Zoom H5 handy recorder, which I have right here, and I'll pass it on once I give a little brief description. So this is excellent. This is, very versatile. You could use this indoors, outdoors, as you see in the picture. That's me interviewing a K-12 educator for the Veterans Legacy Program. What she's doing is headstone rubbings, which is one of the exercises they do as part of this program to honor and memorialize veterans. And so I wanted to capture her emotion in real time while she was doing it. This is a very emotional exercise. And so this allowed me to capture that moment because in addition to this being a recorder, so a mixer, it's also a microphone, right? So I have this mic right here, and using either one or two of their inputs, I can now, have myself as in that picture. I'm using the mic and I'm then recording her because this is also a mic. There's 2 inputs, meaning that you could actually record 3 people with this. Or you could just record 2 people. What I've done this sometimes. You set it on the table and you plug in both the microphones. You give one to the person, to your guest, you give one to yourself, and now you have 2 people recording. Or like I said, you could record 3 people by having 2 connected, giving 2 mics to 2 people, and then you're using this one. So it's very versatile. It allows you to really record in any setting, really. And you have it comes with a windscreen in case it's really windy outside. This prevents wind from sort of ruining your audio, because it really does ruin your audio. And yeah, the microphone I have here is this one. So I'll pass it around. You all can decide. You can turn it on if you want, play around with it. That's sort of the first. All right, this is sort of my go-to. This is what I use almost all the time when I record. It is the Zoom PodTrack P4. I don't know, admittedly, if these prices are accurate, so forgive me. I should have checked, but inflation, things change a lot. So this was like what it was 2 years ago. This might not be the case, but I think it's still, given the market of podcasting equipment, I think it's still the best bang for your buck because it comes with a mixer. It comes with 4 microphones right here. So these types of microphones. And it comes with 4 XLR cables and then 4 headphones. It's literally the entire package. Like, you don't really need anything else. And and it also comes with sort of those stands right here, which I have as well in my book bag that I can show you all. But this simplifies sort of a lot of the unnecessary features from bigger mixers. It's just your gain input. So this is controlling how loud your audio is. And typically I like to leave it at 7, 6. It depends on, if your guest is a little soft spoken, you might need to put it a little bit higher. If your guest is very, projects their voice, you might put it a little lower. Because you never want, as you can see here, this gives you
the information of your audio, you never want the bars to hit the top. Because once the bars hit the top, that's called clipping in the industry. And essentially what that means is now that you've overblown your audio and it's hard to fix that in post. It's gonna be like, it's gonna sound like, you know. So ideally, like you wanna be around this range, and it all depends on how you adjust the gain inputs. This right here is the volume of your headphones. So this is basically just how comfortable you wanna be during the recording, but this is not actually how it's gonna sound in the recording. This is just how it's gonna sound in the moment. What's really nice about the PodTrack P4 is that it has a soundboard, A, B, C, D, meaning that, you know, this records with an SD card. So you could put this in your computer and load pre-recorded sound. And then if you assign it in the settings, and now you have pre-recorded audio that you could play in your recording. So this was really useful when I interviewed the K-12 teachers the second year of the program, because I was able to load their responses from a year ago into this mixer and play it in real time and said, how has the project changed since then? And they were fascinated by that feature. Mainly because, as many of them shared with me off the record, they forgot what they told me a year ago, which is valid, you know, yeah. But it was able to really get them back into that frame of mind. So I love this feature. And then, I mean, again, and then these are just sort of mute buttons if you want to mute yourself. And here you could also, it's operated by batteries, which I don't have. And yeah, but it also could work with wall power. So USB-C connected to AV. So I'll pass this around as well. Yep, see. So this is my go-to. I use this for everything. And as you can see, it's basically a portable studio, right? It's not as portable as the other one, the H5, but these are the St. Francis Barracks and St. Augustine. You know, not the best recording spot because there's windows and it's a really open space, but it still is a studio, right? I'm the host here. I have 2 guests, and I'm able to bring basically a studio to them. So, but this also works in the studio. This is the UCF recording studio. This is where I do a lot of the in-person recordings if the guest is able to come to UCF. And oftentimes I use the same P4 mixer. I just place it literally either on this chair on the table, and I then use the professional microphones that UCF has because part of the college, you got to use those. That's the advantages of working with a university. And so yeah, those are the professional grade microphones. If you listen or watch podcasts, a lot of podcasters use the Shure SMB7 microphones. It could add up quickly because it's $400 again. And then those are the Sony headphones. But yeah, that's sort of all the equipment that I use to record this podcast. Software. For virtual recordings, for the longest time I've used Zoom. Zoom's great because everyone knows Zoom. Everyone knows how to use Zoom. So you don't have to worry about if your guest is going to be confused by sort of the interface of another recording software. But lately, and when I say lately, I mean for the past month, I have been experimenting with Riverside. Riverside is a program, it's a virtual recording studio, as they call it, for podcasters only, or mainly for podcasters. So the biggest difference between Zoom and Riverside is that Zoom records everything on a cloud over the internet. Meaning that if your internet sucks, that recording will be bad. Regardless if your internet as the host is good or vice versa. Maybe you have the crappy internet and your guest has awesome connection, but it doesn't matter. It'll bleed into the recording. Riverside records everything locally. So what that means is I'm using my home Wi-Fi, my local, whether I connect the mic to my computer or whether I'm using my computer mic, it's recording everything in the computer, not over the internet. Same thing with the guest. That way it maintains the best quality possible of the recording. When you're done recording in the virtual studio, it will ask everyone in the room to stay on for a few minutes because then that's when it uploads to the internet. And then you can access it. So it basically captures the local video quality, audio quality of you and your guests separately, and then it uploads it to a cloud. So it maintains that original quality. It has other features too, like Riverside is very powered by AI. So it has a lot of AI features. I don't use those AI features, but they are there. And so it's like they'll make transcripts, they'll make show notes, they'll create these like social media reel clips. Like they do a lot of sort of that work if that's interesting to you. But I think it's great. It is costly. I'm on the pro plan, which is $288 a year. So it might be a sort of you have to convince your institution. But I think if it's something that you're gonna be recording a lot of virtual interviews, it's something that I highly recommend because you won't have to be afraid of, oh, what if they have horrible internet, or it takes away those fears. And honestly, my biggest concern when I was starting a month ago was I was afraid that my guests wouldn't know how to enter the studio because it's not Zoom. But it's the same thing. You give them a link, they click the link, they go in, they join, and it's fine. So you do have to use Google Chrome and Microsoft Edge to use Riverside, so Safari is not recommended. And that's maybe a downside for Apple users, but yeah. And I wish I could show you how it actually looks. I was trying to log in before you all came in today, but for some reason it wasn't letting. But if you have any more questions, I'm going to share my card with you all at the end of this. So if you have any questions about Riverside or anything, please feel free to reach out. Okay, software editing, Audacity. I know there is Audition and there's a bunch of other programs. Riverside actually has its own editing interface. Audacity is free for Windows and Apple users. It is so simple to use. I mean, this might seem like a lot because there's a lot of tracks in the audio, but if you compare this to like Audition, it's night and day. Audition is so convoluted. It gives you more tools, sure, but I produce all of my audio work with Audacity. So I highly recommend it. As I mentioned before, I also work for the Florida Historical Society. I'm the media production assistant, so I produce radio segments for their program called Florida Frontiers, which airs on NPR affiliates across most of the state. Unfortunately, not in Maine, which sucks because native Maine. So my family can hear me. But we are available on our website. We catalog all our programs there. My point is, I use Audacity for that show as well, looking at that broadcast on NPR. So it does the job, and so it's very simple to use. And again, if you have any questions about sort of tips and tricks with Audacity, I'm more than happy to answer. Hopefully, once the micro credential is up and running, that will be definitely a module in the course how to use Audacity, and we can definitely go through more of a walkthrough there. Transcripts, I use Premiere Pro. I know I may be a little, I don't even want to say old fashioned, but I may be a little outdated with this because I know there's more powerful programs like Descript. Riverside also produces transcripts, which I've used here and there. I still find Premiere Pro to be the most accurate. Riverside, for some reason, it's not as accurate as I thought it would be, given it's AI powered. So Premiere Pro allows users to generate accurate transcripts, and also, yeah, it's audio only, right? So, you don't have to have a video file, even though Premiere is mainly associated with video editing. You could just drop in an audio only recording and it still produces the transcript. You can then take that text file and put it on Word or put it on whatever word processing to make further edits accordingly. Okay, hosting. We at the University of Central Florida History Department, we use Podbean as our hosting server. Our plan is the unlimited audio. Again, the pricing might be off because I don't know if that's gone up in recent years, but we were paying $108 a year for one podcast, right? So if you are thinking of creating a network of shows and series, I actually wouldn't recommend Podbean. I would recommend Captivate, which I don't have really any experience in terms of using the interface, not yet. You know, we're in the middle of that process and we're trying to get our first episode out by January. We're gonna use Captivate to do that. But from all the research I've done to sort of convince UCF to to leave Podbean and go to Captivate, it's $204 a year for unlimited podcasts and network support. Meaning you could create as many shows as you want under one umbrella, under one institution, whether it's, you know, the FIU Public Humanities Lab or whatever sort of department you're working in, you could create a podcast network. And it won't charge you extra for those shows. And it also grants team management access. Okay, these are the resources. So please scan your phone. It should, let me know if it doesn't work. It should take you to a public Google document that has a list of sources. Great, cool, thanks, Eric, I appreciate that. Yeah, and there's just a few resources there that I mentioned, either in this presentation, explicitly or implicitly. And it's, again, it's a Google document, so I can continuously update it if there's something that, you know, you want me to have in there. Again, I'll provide my contact. Everyone scanned it? Okay, and then before we have our Q&A, please scan this. This is our podcast that's coming out about the memory of Negro Fort. This is a flyer that I created for promotion because we've gone to several conferences now to present on the podcast and promote it. So again, it's just a Google Forms link to asking your name and your email and how you heard about the podcast. That way, we want to build a community of interested listeners now rather than once the podcast is out. We're trying to be a little proactive rather than reactive. And these, again, talk about strategies. This is the strategy we're doing right now. So, you know, I can't speak to how successful it is yet, but, you know, when you're thinking about your podcast and ways to promote it, creating flyers, you know, maximizing all the opportunities that you have, you know, whether it's public speaking at events like this or one at conferences or just word of mouth, you know, social media, all these things sort of help